Last week, I told you the first thing on your bifold that Jesus is the Son of God is what he begins by saying, that Jesus is God's Son. And I just want to resound those words in this room tonight, that Jesus is not a prophet, that he's not just a prophet, that he's not just a manifestation of God, that he is greater than the prophets, that he is the Son of God. The second thing I said is that God's appointed heir is who Jesus is. He's God's appointed heir, and that he's the agent of creation. That the appointed heir, you guys remember this? I talked about how as the heir of creation, that he owns everything. That in the end, once all of history has culminated, Jesus will rule it all because of what he has done. He's the heir. When God dies and he's given over everything to somebody, he's given it over to himself. He's given it to God. Remember that? Talked about somebody has to die. You guys remember that? But God died, yeah, right? So when God dies, he gives over, he's going to inherit it all. So he rules everything because it's his. But then it says that the universe was made through him. So he rules everything from creation, and he also rules it in the culmination. That from front to back, Jesus owns everything, and that he could be trusted because he has authority. That Jesus is not God's backup plan because you sin. He was always the plan from the beginning, and he became the action of the plan in the middle. That Jesus is something that God has always intended for you. He is the heir of all things and the agent of creation. And I want to continue reading in verse 3 tonight. If you have your Bibles, he continues, and he's telling you the recipe for making it through your hardship. He's giving you the thing that you need to push through whatever you're going through to start to live for God again. And he says, the sun, start to imagine, the sun is the radiance of God's glory. He is the exact representation of his being, sustained in all things by his powerful word. After he has provided purification for sin, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty. You're going through hard times? That's what you need to look at. That's who you need to look at. And I just want to walk you through these other things really quickly. Number 4, if you're still writing those down, it says here in verse 3 that Jesus is God's personified glory. Personified glory. I want you to write that down. He's God's personified glory. Now, when you hear the word glory, sometimes if you grew up in a real traditional background, to be in glory, it means to be in heaven, right? Glory is heaven, like there's glory on the other side. But glory is just the power of presence. It's the power of presence, right? So he uses the idea of the sun, that the radiance, it's the glory of the sun. Like, it's not a different thing from the sun. It's the power of the presence of the sun. The reason why it's hot at noon is because the sun is present and you're feeling its power. In Hollywood, they call it stage presence. You know, there's some people who have stage presence. There's some actors and actresses, when they come on a screen, like Denzel Washington, he ain't got to do nothing. Like, he just got to show up and just... And it's like, oh my gosh, it's this, and because he has presence. And then there's some other people who they could be in the room and you're like, oh, I didn't see you there. I didn't know you were there. It scared me. Creeping up on me, right? But it's presence. And you know what it's like, because there's some people who, when they come around, it's their glory. So the glory of a thing, the glory of the sun is the rays of a sun. So that's the idea of glory, right? It is present. So he's saying Jesus has the same glory as God. He is God's glory personified. That he has the same presence as God. That people who walked with Jesus, do you remember what they said about him? That they were just around him and they were like, who is this man who reads scriptures that we've been reading for years, but he does it with such authority? It's the glory of God. That he wasn't just reading it like everybody else read it. They were feeling his presence. There were people who were sinners. They were shameful. They didn't want to be around anybody at all, but they were drawn to Jesus because of his glory. He had the same presence as God. He didn't have a smaller presence. It wasn't that God had big presence. Jesus had, he said he's God's personified glory. Like the sun. You're feeling the sun. It's not a different thing from the sun. The sun rays and the sun, it's the glory of a thing. It's the power of the presence of something. Number 5 is Jesus is God's revelation. The 5th thing I want you to write there. Jesus is God's revelation. It says he is the exact representation of God's being. So this Greek word is the word that comes from exact representation, and it's karakter. That's where we get the word character, karakter, the exact representation. Now, the karakter in the Greek culture, it's actually a thing. It's a physical thing. It's a tool that had an impression, and if you stamped it in clay or in metal, it would leave the impression. So that's how they made coins, right? They would take the caracter and they would stamp it into some kind of iron or metal, and they would take it off and it would leave the representation. Now many of you who've studied the book of Hebrews, you probably heard that Jesus is the exact representation of God. And this word character, I want to correct something for you, because we were often taught, at least me, that Jesus is like God came and he bam, stamped them, and I could see the image of God in Jesus. That is wrong. He says Jesus is the character. He is the form of God. He is the shape of God. That he is the thing that stamps you, that makes you look like God. He is not a representative for God. He is the exact representation of who God is. So he is God's revelation. He is the revelation of God, and he is not the representation of God. He is not God's representative on earth. He is the revelation of God on earth. I just want you to know who you need to be looking at. Going through hard times, I know that you might think the answer is more of something, and I need to maybe learn a few things more. I'm telling you, it's someone who you need to start to look at. Start to look at the man who is not lesser than God, but is actually the exact revelation of who God is. So we said that he has the same presence of God, and he's the same person as God. That's the character, right? He's the same person, the same presence, and the same person. Like me on this stage tonight, I am Denville, representing Denville. I'm not representing anyone but me. When Jesus comes, he is God representing God. He's not another thing representing something else. He is the thing representing himself. That's why he says things like, no one can come to the Father but through me. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father, because I am the character of God. I am not just a similar thing. I am him. I am Denville representing Denville. And I will stand on, if I ever go to court and I'm a witness, they say I could be a witness for myself. Are you going to represent yourself? Yes, I am. Yes, I am. I'm going to represent me. I am Denville representing Denville. Jesus would say, I am God representing God. Now, you can go and represent me, and that would make you a different thing from me, but you can stand as my representation. Jesus is not that. Jesus is God representing God. Are you with me? All right, number 6, here we go. Jesus is God's cosmic sustainer. Right? This one in verse 3, he says, he sustains all things by his powerful word. Right? He's God's cosmic sustainer. That God is always speaking, and it's by speaking he's holding all of creation together. And he's saying Jesus is that. Jesus is the word which is the very exact nature of God's thoughts. That God is thinking it, and he's speaking it, and he's holding it. And the thing that he's thinking and the thing that he's speaking is Jesus, because Jesus is the word made flesh. And he said because of Jesus, everything is holding itself together. That the same kind of idea as you have of a God who holds it all together like this. Watch me. You think of a God who holds it together like this. And I'm saying maybe think of a God who holds it together like a nucleus, like Jesus as a human. He holds it together like this. He stands in the middle of humanity, in the middle of the universe, holding it all together like this. And God is not just holding it like this, but he's holding it all together like this, all on me. He stands in the middle of it, holding it all together. He's sustaining the universe by his powerful word. And lastly, number 7, Jesus is God's unique sacrifice. And the last thing it says there is, after he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty. I want you to underline those words, purification of sins, in your Bible. And some of you need to hear this tonight, that God is not just forgiven and forgetting. That would be nice, but he does something better than forgive and forget. He actually transforms, and he makes your sin pure. He actually makes you pure. He doesn't just say, like, the best that we could do is if you did something wrong against me, I can forgive you, I can forget it, and we can move on, but I can never make you pure. 7 things the author gives us as to who Jesus is. So I want you to share which of these statements about Jesus expresses something about him that is new for you, or that is difficult for you to understand, or that is different from the way that you usually understand. I want you to look at that list. I want you to be honest for a moment and say, you know what? Like, this is new for me, this is hard for me, or this is just different from what I've heard. Here's what's going to happen next for all of chapter 1. So all of chapter 1, if you guys remember, this is not about instructions and what you need to do to get your life together. This is who you need to look at. Because there's something about what you're looking at that changes your situation. It's called perspective. And there's something even far more supernatural about what you look at that affects your heart, that affects your mind. I try to talk guys through this who wrestle with pornography, and I'm like, man, there's something about what you look at that just really affects your inside in a way that you cannot even imagine. And I think there's something far profound that even psychologists and many doctors are learning today about the images we see and how they affect us psychologically. But that's just one dimension. There's another dimension of the supernatural. And the Bible says things like, if you just contemplate his glory and look upon him, then you'll be transformed into his likeness. And many people are like, how do I even do that? Like, that sounds really fairy tale. But then when you compare that up against to the reality of if I take my natural eyes and look at natural things, they really deteriorate my inside, or they can inspire my inside. If you take your spiritual eyes and you start to contemplate on spiritual things, it has the same effect, because remember that the spiritual is animating the natural. And so this should be teaching you something about spirituality that you ought to know. And so he's telling you who you should be looking at. And then he goes off into something that seems very strange. He starts to talk about angels. And he's basically saying that Jesus is greater than the angels. That's this next section. Jesus is greater than the angels. And that's his point. Jesus is greater than the angels. What was happening is that they were turning away from the covenant. You guys remember I talked to you about your Bible's division in 2 covenants, your old covenant and your new covenant. Now, in this old covenant, this covenant came about. History has it, and I just want to show you some verses. I'm not going to have time to read them, but there are some verses I want you to see there. The first one is in Deuteronomy, and this first verse in Deuteronomy talks about how the law of what you should and should not do was given on Mount Sinai to Moses by angels, that angels came down and descended on Mount Sinai and gave the covenant, right? And then in Galatians, Paul says God gave his law through the angels to Moses, right? So angels are a part of the lawgivers. Acts 7:38, this is Stephen's defense, as Stephen is dying, and Stephen is making this proclamation to the Jews, and he says, when the angels spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, and there Moses received life-giving words to pass on to us. And so what this author is doing here is awesome, it's profound. He says, you ought to pay attention to Jesus because you're drifting away from the covenant. You're drifting away from living by faith in Jesus, and you're trying to revert to this old covenant of how I must live and I must worry about what I can do, and I'm trying to do it all on my own, and I'm trying to reach God by my own behavior. I press down on myself when I do bad, and I feel good about myself when I'm doing good. That's how we feel. When you got a little sin in your life, you kind of sit down during worship, but then once you get out that sin, you start clapping and shouting and start judging people who are sitting down, right? It's just this weird thing that we do, right? But he's saying there's something about this attitude of my relationship with God is dependent on my behavior and my ability to fulfill the law that was given by angels to Moses. And they were thinking of going back into that system of living of my behavior. But what this writer is telling them, the new covenant is better than the old covenant. That's what you write. That's what you write on the back of this thing. Still going to write that. The new covenant that Jesus announces is far greater than the first covenant that the angels announced. What he is saying is that the covenant that Jesus gives is better than the covenant that angels gave. That's his point. But here's how I'm going to sell this to you. It's not just that the covenant is better. The one who gave you the covenant is better. And so to do this, the author uses Psalms. He uses this old covenant. He uses these writings to prove his point, because this is what they were living by. So it's like when they started to quote something, they knew exactly what the author was talking about. You guys with me? If I said, I have a dream, who am I quoting? So you guys know, right? So you're going to hear some quotes. And when he quotes them, he's actually talking about something that was written in the Old Covenant that the audience knew. But the thing about the Old Covenant, and if you can get this about Bible study in general, it will unlock a revelation for you I think is going to be good. The Old Covenant was written this way. People like David, they would get their pens and they would start to write their history, just what's going on, because God revealed himself to the Jews. right? He called these people, you guys remember we talked about that last week? He called one man named Abraham and said, Abraham, I'm going to share my glory with you and spread my glory through all the earth, that the whole earth is going to be blessed by you. So this nation is through whom God was revealing himself. And so when they wrote down, hey, like this is just what I did today, it's my journal, right? So they're writing stuff down, but as they're writing it down, they're writing down history, but they're not just writing down history. There's something bigger that's going on. As they're writing about the war that they're about to go into, they're also documenting the power that's going to help them to win that war. And so the scriptures, I'm saying, becomes natural when David writes them, but they become supernatural because the presence by which David is writing in is inspired by God. And so the scriptures are not just a collection of history. They work in a real profound way that there was a spirit orchestrating that moment. And so when he wrote it, it wasn't just that he was writing history. The spirit that was guiding him to win these wars, the spirit that was making these miracles happen, somehow are captured in that story. Let me give you an example. Has something ever happened to you? And like, it's a long time ago. It's like something history. But then you start to talk about it today and all the feelings come back. And it's almost like it was happening again. It's like, but it's history. It's like, yeah, it's history. But the power behind it comes with the story. That's your Old Testament scriptures. And so what is happening with these scriptures is that, yeah, David had intention when he was writing it, but God had intention when he was orchestrating it. And so David may have meant one thing, but then we realize that God meant another thing. You've had that happen to you too, where you thought that you were saying one thing, but then the person heard something else. And it doesn't matter what you said, it's about what they heard. Right? Or maybe you greeted someone and you told them, like, I'm praying for you, and they just started bawling. You're like, oh! But what you didn't know is that they were praying, that God put them on someone's heart to be praying for them, and you were an answer to prayer, and you didn't know it. God was orchestrating, and you were just living your life. David was just living his life, but God was orchestrating. So what this author's doing, he's looking at David writing and God orchestrating. David may have meant this, but God was meaning this. And if you could put these two things together, I'm going to show you Jesus in the Old Testament, how Jesus would have taught his disciples to understand him after the resurrection. Verse 4, he became so much more superior to the angels as the name he inherited is superior to theirs. For to which of the angels did God ever say, you are my son? Now he's quoting here Psalm 2 verse 7, but he's taken words that these words were actually written about a king's enthronement. So whenever David or one of the kings was being enthroned, people would come out and they would sing this song. It's something that the prophet would recite to the king. So when there's a new king, this is kind of the inauguration of a king that they would read, right? And so what he's doing is he's going back and he's quoting this line and he's saying, listen, God never said this about angels, but he did say this about kings being enthroned, but now he's applying it and saying, God wasn't just talking about kings being enthroned, he was actually talking about Jesus. Right? So in the Psalm, it's talking about King David. It's talking about all the Old Testament kings. When they get enthroned, God actually says, today you have become my son. I'm going to rule Israel through you. And he's saying, oh, but they didn't know that it was prophetic. It was inspirational. God was saying something because I'm going to say these words again to Jesus. Today you have become my son, and I'm going to rule through you. It's a picture. It's a shadow. There's something real that's happening here, but it's pointing to a reality that will soon occur, right? So he's saying Jesus is called a son, but the angels are not called son. That's the first thing I want you to write there. The angels is a servant, but Jesus is a son. That's the point he's trying to make here. Like, God never called any one of them angels sons. And if you go back and read that psalm, which I want to encourage you to go back and read these psalms, and I want you to read the full length of these scriptures, and I want you to see what the author of Hebrews had in mind versus what the author of the psalm had in mind. And sometimes you'll see how they overlap and how they're parallel. And you'll see the beauty of how Jesus is being revealed in the scriptures. Verse 6, and again, this is what God says again, when he brings his firstborn into the world, he says, let all the angels worship him. Now he's taken from Psalm 97, from Psalm 104, and the point he's making, point two, is that angels are worshipers and Jesus is worshiped. I've been answering some questions this week about, like, is Jesus God? Like the Trinity, is he the kind of God, little God? How does that actually work? And I want to invite you to not try to figure God out, but to look at him and to allow yourself to stand in awe of the beauty and the majesty of that which you cannot comprehend. He is not a math equation that he's beckoning you to figure him out. He is far greater than your mind could ever wrap around him, and he knows it, but he calls you to not know him in that way, but to know him fully by giving yourself to him. God is not inviting you to have the details of the Trinity figured out, and if anybody can give you a perfect explanation of the Trinity, that's how you know they don't get it. Because if you can grasp it, it means that you don't get it, because it is ungraspable. It is unfathomable. It is the mystery of the majesty of God. And sometimes I think we just need to humble ourselves to the mystery of who God is, but there's some things where you have to allow your heart to be humble enough to give yourself over to the mystery. Because I could try to explain to you how Jesus is God, and all my words, as accurate as they might be to the scriptures, they still fall short, because you just need to see him. You just need to see him. I had this exercise in middle school. My teacher gave me write-in assignments because I love to write. And she said, and I want you to think about this. She said, can you write a description of the sun to someone who is blind and has never seen? How would you describe it? What adjectives would you use? Bright. They don't know that. It's like what would you use? I was an atheist for years. And that's like one question that puzzled me. And it was years after I became a Christian, I figured out the answer. Like, the Jesus answer is, open their eyes. In verse 8, he says, but to the Son, he, I want you to circle he, because he is God, right? See that there in chapter 1, verse 8? But to the Son, he, God says, your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. It's like God is speaking to someone, and he's saying, oh God, your throne will last forever and ever, and a scepter of justice will be the scepter of your kingdom. And you have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Look at what God says to this. Therefore, God, your God, has set you above other companions by anointing you with the oil of gladness. Now, he's saying we're looking at a different kind of being here, because we're looking at a kind of human who is God, because he says here, your throne, O God. God is saying to a being, your throne, O God. So you're looking at a being who is God, and then he also says, like, therefore, God, your God has set you above. Look, watch this mystery, watch me. He's saying, your throne, O God, has set you above. But your God has set you. You're talking about a God who is a God and a God who has a God. When Jesus comes and Jesus says something like I only do what I see the Father doing. He said, oh, I have a God. But then he says, if you see me, you see the Father. He says, I am a God. Like, I have a God and I am a God. Jesus loved to quote Psalm 110. My Lord said to my Lord, sit at your right hand. This is Matthew 22. The Pharisees were stumped. They said, what do you think about the Messiah? Jesus says, let me quote Psalm 110 for you. My Lord said to my Lord, sit at your right hand. Who was he talking to? Number 3, Jesus is God. Plain and simple. The author makes no confusion about it. He's trying to let you know that Jesus is God. Do you get it yet? This is the point that he's trying to make. Jesus is God. In the beginning, you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are at the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. He's saying this is the praise. These were psalms that they used to sing to God. And he's saying, if Jesus is the person of God, he is the presence of God, then we ascribe to him the praise we give to God. This is what it means to be a Christian, that we look at Jesus. And so, 4, he's making it clear that Jesus is creator. And so we ascribe Jesus Creation, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and through him all things were made, and by him there was nothing that was made that was ever made. And this author makes it clear that he sustains all things, that he's the agent of creation, that if you're going to thank God for creating mountains and stars and sky, he says you can ascribe that to Jesus, because my Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. And this is, I'm going to run out of time. Let me tell you why this is important. This is going to be really important for you to know when you're worshiping God, because here's the thing. When you think about the Jesus who's died for you and the Jesus who has loved you, when you realize that it is the God who created all things, who's busy upholding the universe, who has created and spawned everything that you've ever seen, and he takes the time to incarnate and think of you, and he dies for you and as you. It is not just any old body. It is God himself. And when you realize what God, creator of the universe, upholder, sustainer of the universe, when you realize what that God will do for you, you start to look at your situations differently. You start to look at yourself differently, because somebody important loves you. It's not just a representation of God. God did not send a representative for you. He came himself. Okay. All right. So he is creator. The last thing there comes out of Psalm 110. I already quoted that. He says, my Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make my enemies your footstool. And thing number 5 there, that Jesus is enthroned. I like this one, and the angels are employed. Because it said the angels are out to do his bidding, that Jesus sits on a throne, and the angels go out and do his bidding. So it said the angels just did his bidding when they brought you the law, but he came himself when he gave you a new covenant. And the bottom line here is that Jesus is greater than the angels because he's enthroned in heaven and he reigns over the world. Chapter 2, he goes on, he says, then we must pay careful attention, therefore. I want you to circle that word, therefore. Therefore means that what came before is actually really important. So therefore is, because of who Jesus is, you must pay close attention, therefore. Let's pay attention to what we've heard so that we do not drift away. For since the message spoken through angels was binding, and every violation of disobedience received its just punishment, how shall we escape if we ignore such a great salvation? If you look at what happened in the Old Covenant, and in the Old Covenant, the law and the structure of what they gave received punishment. It says, and God just sent that through angels. If he actually came through you, himself, then what do you think that's going to be if you violate it? If you violated the Old Covenant, you were kicked out of community, right? You were probably put to death. And he says, if you violate this covenant, what do you think will happen? Now, this is not a threat. I want to tell you what this is. This is about purpose. God did not make you to decide if you were fit to go to heaven or hell. I want you to hear that. God did not make you and say, let's see how well she does. Is she fit for heaven or is she fit for hell? That when God made you, we talked about this last week, he made you and placed you in the earth, and he gave you a crown of glory that you would be like him and spread his character, his nature into the universe. He gave you dominion, that you would rule over everything, and that you would spread his love and his character into the earth. And so when that was violated, he gave the first covenant. And this first covenant was, listen, if you want to live in your purpose, you must be in the glory of God, with the glory of God, and for the glory of God. I want you to write those 3 things down. It's not on your notes, but I want you to write them down because I think they're good. That in order to fulfill your purpose, you must be in the glory of God, with the glory of God, for the glory of God. In order to fulfill your purpose, you must be in God's presence, with God's presence, for God's presence. If you want to live your real life and real purpose, you've got to be in God's presence as you were in the garden, that everything was perfect, walking with Adam in the cool of the day, that there's nothing separating me and him, that I'm with God. You were made to be with God. You were made to be in his presence. You're made to be in the presence of God. That is why when you pass away, you are in the presence of God for all of eternity, because that's where you belong. That's why in the beginning, they were in the garden with God for all of eternity. Yeah, that's how it was supposed to be, because in the presence is where they belong. So they belong in the presence of God. But it wasn't just in the presence of God to float around on clouds. They were supposed to have the character of God with the glory of God. They were supposed to have his character also, because they were supposed to spread his glory for the glory of God, for the purposes of making his name famous. That you're supposed to be in his presence, like I spend time in the presence of God, my first and 10. And what that does is it infuses me and it makes me start to be with the glory of God. So I'm in the glory of God, I'm in his presence, and I start to become with the glory of God, with his presence, and I start to spread it for his glory, to make him famous in the earth. Now I'm living my life intentionally in his presence, with his presence, for his presence. That's what the covenant was supposed to do. Be holy, for I am holy. That if you can follow these rules, Israelites, and follow these laws, and you'll be in my presence. Come into the tabernacle, into the Holy of Holies, and be in my presence. And in my presence, get rid of sin. And when you're finally in my presence, now you'll have my character if you follow my laws. And then I will spread my fame in all the earth through you, like I told Abraham I would. In my presence, with my presence, for my presence. But that was violated. So when Jesus comes, what Jesus does is Jesus comes and he is giving you a new covenant to fulfill the thing that the law demanded, because what the law demanded was actually correct. The old covenant and the new covenant stand for the same purpose, is to give you a way to be in the presence of God, with the presence of God, for the purpose of spreading the presence of God. Same purpose. What the Holy Spirit does makes you be in the presence of God, fills you with the presence of God. I start to change. And I start to live for the presence of God, to make him famous in the earth. That's the same purpose. But he goes on and he says, it is not to angels that he subjected the world to come about which I am speaking. Psalm 8, he says, what is mankind that you're mindful of me? You guys remember that? Who am I that you are mindful of me, that you hear me when I call, right? That's Psalm 8. He said, so he's quoting, he said, who is mankind that you're mindful of them? A son of man, that you care for him. You made them, circle them, you made them, that's us humans. God, you made us a little bit lower than the angels, and you made us with glory and honor, and you put everything under our feet. When we were in the garden, this is what you did. You have authority in the earth. You have dominion. You have the glory of God. But listen to what he says. Yet at the present, we do not see everything subject to them. Even though God gave us authority, God gave us dominion, he crowned us with glory, he gave me all this power. How many of you keep hearing these teachings about how much power you got, how much dominion you got, and then you go home and even your toaster doesn't work? Do you guys see what he's doing? He says, but we do see Jesus, who he was made a little bit lower than the angels. Just for a little while. Just for a little while. And now he's crowned with honor and glory. I thought I was crowned with honor and glory. He is now crowned with honor and glory because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God, he might taste death for everyone. Jesus restores my divine identity. He restores my divine identity. That's what Jesus does. He is making you like who you were made to be. He becomes what you are to make you what you're supposed to be. That's what God does. He becomes what you are to make you what you're supposed to be. I'm going to give you the last one there. Jesus rescues my human dignity. He steps into my humanity and he dignifies it with the resurrection. Like he restores my divine identity by restoring my authority in the earth, and then he rescues my human dignity. And the bottom line here is that to have real life, we must remain faithful to the covenant that God announced through Jesus. That's the last thing I want you to write there. How you guys doing?
Great. Thank you.
I want you to make practice of seeing Jesus. And tonight, I want to invite you to just look at Jesus. Just look at him. And the way that we look at him is we look at these kinds of passages that glorify him, that magnify him, that exalt him, that puts him back in his right place. And somehow, in a supernatural way, guys, I promise you, in a supernatural way, it changes who you are. It changes the way you look at your life. It changes, there's something about beholding him. It's a mystery. Don't try to figure it out. Enter into it. Enter into it. Let's stand together.